In Massachusetts, there was an old psychiatric hospital that no one called by its official name anymore. It had been closed in the 1980s after a series of deaths that were never explained. Some said they were patients. Others swore that doctors had also vanished without a trace. The records disappeared. The windows were sealed shut, and a rusted gate became the only thing separating the building from the main road. During the day, the hospital looked like nothing more than a concrete skeleton covered in graffiti. But at night, it was different. Residents claimed to see small lights moving through the corridors, like old lanterns walking on their own. There had been no electricity for decades, no generator, no working wires. Yet sometimes the second-floor windows glowed for a few seconds before returning to complete darkness. Drivers passing by would slow down without realizing it. Those who lived nearby closed their curtains. And that was exactly what caught the attention of Ethan Miller. Ethan was 22 years old and believed every mystery had a logical explanation. To him, ghost stories were just small-town exaggerations. When he heard the rumors at the local bar about lights, voices, and shadows, he gave a short laugh and said, "If there's light inside, it's just a homeless guy or some teenagers messing around." That same week, he decided to prove it. On a Friday night, he called two friends and brought a camera in his phone, convinced he would leave a funny video to post later. They parked the car a few meters from the main gate. The wind made the rusted metal creak, as if someone were slowly pushing it open. The hospital stood before them like a dead giant. The windows looked like empty eyes. The silence was too heavy for a place so large. When they crossed through the broken gate, Ethan felt something strange. Not exactly fear, but the uneasy feeling of entering a place where no one was meant to be. The air was cold, even though it was summer. Before they even reached the building, one of the second-floor windows lit up for a second. It wasn't a strong flash. It was a weak, yellowish glow, like an old light bulb being switched on and off quickly. The three of them froze in silence. Ethan swallowed hard, tried to laugh, and said it was probably just a reflection of a car passing on the road. But deep down, for the first time, he felt that the hospital was not as abandoned as it seemed. As soon as they crossed the front door, Ethan raised his phone and pressed the record button. The flashlight beam revealed a long corridor filled with crooked doors and peeling walls. The floor was covered with broken glass and old papers that crackled beneath their feet. The air felt heavy. It smelled of mold and something harder to explain, like expired medicine mixed with rust. Every step produced a strange echo, as if the building were much larger on the inside than it looked from the outside. Doors creaked on their own, opening a few inches and then slowly closing, without anyone touching them. "See? Just the wind," Ethan whispered, trying to sound calm. But there was no wind. They walked into an old operating room. The table still stood in the center of the room, rusted, with dark stains that time had failed to erase. Broken lamps hung from the ceiling like dead eyes. The silence inside was absolute, so deep they could hear their own hearts beating. Ethan pointed his phone at the table and joked, "If there's someone here, now's the time to show yourself." That's when it happened. In the middle of the recording, a sound cut through the silence. Low, dragging. "Don't leave yet." The three of them froze. None of them had spoken. One of Ethan's friends stepped backward, tripped over a chair, and almost fell. Another covered his mouth, trying not to scream. Cold filled the room, as if someone had opened a freezer. "Why, you heard that, right?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking for the first time. The phone kept recording, but the silence returned, a heavy silence. And in that moment, Ethan realized something disturbing. The voice seemed to have come from right behind them. The sound came suddenly. Footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from the floor above. The three of them exchanged silent glances. The corridor they stood in was narrow, and the ceiling creaked as if someone were walking directly over their heads. It wasn't a random crack of old wood. It was a steady rhythm. One step, then another, like someone walking calmly. Ethan aimed the flashlight at the staircase. "You heard that, right?" he whispered. No one answered. They simply began to climb. Each step groaned beneath their weight. The darkness seemed to grow thicker the higher they went. The flashlight beam shook, revealing walls scratched with old phrases and broken doors. When they reached the second floor, the sound of footsteps stopped. The hallway was different. Wheelchairs were lined up on both sides, forming a narrow path down the center. All of them faced the same direction. Some were still rocking slightly, as if they had been pushed only seconds before. The air turned icy. Ethan took a step forward, trying to understand what he was seeing. That was when he felt it, a presence behind him. It was as if someone was standing very close. So close he could feel the warm air of a breath against the skin of his neck. The hair on his arm stood up instantly. He didn't dare turn around. His heart raced. His throat went dry. The flashlight began to shake so badly that the light danced across the walls, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. There's someone here," he murmured. No answer came, only the slow creak of one of the wheelchairs, moving by itself at the end of the hallway. Panic took over. After seeing the wheelchair move on its own, no one argued anymore. There was no more curiosity, no more joking, only one certainty. It was time to leave. They ran back down the corridor, nearly tripping over their own feet, and rushed down the stairs. Ethan's flashlight swung from side to side, lighting up walls that seemed to close in around them. When they finally reached the main entrance, Ethan grabbed the door handle and pulled hard. Nothing. The door didn't move an inch. He tried again, this time with both hands. He pushed, then pulled, locked. The door just wouldn't open anymore. That was when they heard the knocking, coming from inside the walls, as if someone were pounding from behind the concrete, begging for help. The knocking spread through the corridor. One came from the left, another from the right, then from the ceiling. The sound echoed as if the entire building were full of trapped people. One of his friends started to cry, repeating that he wanted to get out of there. Ethan raised his phone to shine more light on the door, and the screen went dark. On its own, it had shown 60% battery just seconds before. He pressed the button again and again. Nothing. Black screen. And at that exact moment, the knocking suddenly stopped. The hospital fell silent once more. No wind, no voices, only the sound of their breathing, fast and out of control. And the terrible feeling that now, the building knew exactly where they were. When they finally managed to escape the hospital, none of them looked back. They ran to the car as if the building could follow them. Their hands were shaking so badly that Ethan almost dropped the keys. They jumped inside, slammed the doors, and sped away without saying a single word the entire way home. That night, they swore to each other they would never return to that place. They wouldn't tell anyone about it. They wouldn't joke about the hospital ever again. What they had experienced had gone far beyond curiosity. Hours later, already at home, Ethan decided to watch the video he had recorded. He sat on his bed and pressed play. At first, there were only empty corridors, creaking doors, and the sound of their rapid breathing. Everything seemed normal, until the moment they began climbing to the second floor. Ethan paused the video, rewound a few seconds, and then he saw it. At the end of the hallway, behind them, there was something that hadn't been there when they passed. A human figure, standing still, too tall to be a child, too thin to be an ordinary adult. Its face was not visible, where there should have been eyes and a mouth. There was only a dark stain, as if the light could not reach that part of its body. The figure did not move. It did not walk. It did not come closer. It only watched. The video kept playing, and for several seconds the thing remained there at the end of the corridor, while they walked on, unaware they were being followed. And then, the figure simply disappeared. Ethan turned off his phone with sweaty hands. His stomach twisted. He sent the video to his friends, who replied almost immediately, asking the same question. What the hell was that? None of them had an answer. From that day on, the story spread. The hospital gained a new reputation, no longer as an abandoned building, but as a place where something lived. And to this day, when the sun goes down, the road becomes empty. No one in that town goes near that hospital. In Nuttleburg, deep in West Virginia, there once stood an old coal mining and processing complex that, for decades, the site operated day and night. The machines never stopped. Rail tracks carried wagons filled with coal into enormous industrial buildings hidden among steep mountains and dense forest. But all that ended after a serious accident during a night shift, killing 11 workers inside the facility. Authorities declared the place unsafe, and not long after, the factory was permanently shut down. As the years passed, Nuttleburg was slowly swallowed by silence. Steel structures rusted. Broken windows became coated with dust and spiderwebs. Abandoned tracks disappeared beneath thick vegetation. What had once been a center of constant labor turned into a valley of forgotten ruins. For nearly 30 years, no one officially entered the site. Residents of nearby towns avoided the road that led to the complex, especially after sunset. Some claimed they could hear metallic sounds coming from the valley at night, as if the old machines were still running on their own. Others swore they saw small lights moving between the buildings, even though no power source remained active. In 2017, a student named Rachel Thompson decided to ignore all those warnings. She needed to photograph an abandoned industrial site for a school project about the history of labor in the United States. While researching online, she found very few recent images of Nuttleburg, only old records and vague accounts of the accident. To Rachel, it seemed perfect. She placed her camera in her backpack, her phone in her pocket, and drove alone to the end of the narrow road that led to the complex. When she stepped out of the car, the silence was absolute. No birds, no strong wind, only the distant creak of ancient metal echoing through the mountains. Without knowing it, she was about to enter a place that had never let the past go. As soon as Rachel crossed the main entrance of the Nuttleburg complex, the air changed. It was colder inside the valley, as if the sunlight could no longer fully reach those ancient structures. The smell was strong, rust, damp wood, and dust that had settled for decades. Every step she took echoed through the empty warehouses, producing a hollow, almost metallic sound. She began taking photos of the rusted conveyor belts, the twisted tracks, and the massive machines covered in spiderwebs. Everything was still, dead, silent, until the silence was broken. At first, Rachel thought it was the wind, a low sound continuous, coming from inside one of the main warehouses. She stopped walking. The noise sounded like a distant engine slowly turning, a deep rumble, like an industrial machine being switched on after years of sitting idle. Then came another sound, sharper, like metal scraping against metal. She pulled the camera close to her chest and walked slowly toward the source of the noise. The closer she got, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded exactly like a factory running. Inside the warehouse, the darkness was almost complete. Sunlight entered only through cracks in the broken roof. And that was when Rachel heard something even stranger. Voices, very faint, distant, echoing as if they were coming from underground tunnels. They didn't form full sentences, only scattered words, numbers, as if someone were counting work shifts. 3-4 shift. She stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand what she was hearing. Her heart began to beat faster. The sound of the machines grew slightly louder, as if reacting to her presence. Rachel recorded an audio clip on her phone and whispered, "Is someone here?" No human answer came, but the sound of the machines continued, and for a moment, she had the disturbing feeling that the entire place was waking up, as if that abandoned factory were trying to start itself again. Despair took hold of Rachel. She tried to move the pieces of metal and concrete blocking the exit, but they felt impossibly heavy, as if they were fused to the ground itself. Her hands began to tremble, smeared with dust and coal. The sound of the machines kept echoing through the warehouse, now louder, closer. That was when she heard footsteps, slow, dragging, coming from the darkness behind the machines. Rachel stepped back, her chest tightening. The beam of her phone's flashlight reached only a few meters ahead, casting giant shadows on the walls. Each shadow seemed to take on a human shape for a second and then dissolve. Without thinking twice, she pulled her phone from her pocket and called her father. The call took time to connect, as if there were no signal at all in that forgotten place. When she finally heard his voice, she began to cry. "Dad!" "There's someone here with me," she said, barely able to breathe. "Where are you?" he asked, panicked. Rachel tried to explain, but her words came out tangled. Suddenly, the sound of the machines grew louder, as if they had all started up at once. Through the metallic roar, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices, very close now. They didn't come from a single point. They seemed to rise from the walls, from the floor, from the machines themselves. They're here," Rachel whispered into the phone. "But they're not alive." On the other end of the line, her father tried to calm her, telling her to stay where she was, that he would call for help immediately, but the connection began to fail. His voice grew distant and distorted, as if it were being pulled away. Rachel looked around and saw the footprints in the dust begin to multiply, appearing one after another around her, forming a slow circle. "Dad," she called. The last thing he heard was his daughter's voice, low and broken. "They're still working." Then the call dropped. The warehouse fell into absolute silence for a few seconds, and Rachel was left alone, surrounded by boot prints that belonged to no living soul. Despair took hold of Rachel. She tried to move the pieces of metal and concrete blocking the exit, but they felt impossibly heavy, as if they were fused to the ground itself. Her hands began to tremble, smeared with dust and coal. The sound of the machines kept echoing through the warehouse, now louder, closer. That was when she heard footsteps, slow, dragging, coming from the darkness behind the machines. Rachel stepped back, her chest tightening. The beam of her phone's flashlight reached only a few meters ahead, casting giant shadows on the walls. Each shadow seemed to take on a human shape for a second and then dissolve. Without thinking twice, she pulled her phone from her pocket and called her father. The call took time to connect, as if there were no signal at all in that forgotten place. When she finally heard his voice, she began to cry. "Dad!" "There's someone here with me," she said, barely able to breathe. "Where are you?" he asked, panicked. Rachel tried to explain, but her words came out tangled. Suddenly, the sound of the machines grew louder, as if they had all started up at once. Through the metallic roar, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices, very close now. They didn't come from a single point. They seemed to rise from the walls, from the floor, from the machines themselves. They're here," Rachel whispered into the phone. "But they're not alive." On the other end of the line, her father tried to calm her, telling her to stay where she was, that he would call for help immediately, but the connection began to fail. His voice grew distant and distorted, as if it were being pulled away. Rachel looked around and saw the footprints in the dust begin to multiply, appearing one after another around her, forming a slow circle. "Dad!" she called. The last thing he heard was his daughter's voice, low and broken. "They're still working." Then the call dropped. The warehouse fell into absolute silence for a few seconds, and Rachel was left alone, surrounded by boot prints that belonged to no living soul. The search began that very night. Police officers, firefighters, and volunteers descended into the abandoned complex of Nuttleberg with flashlights, search dogs, and rescue equipment. They went through warehouse after warehouse, calling Rachel's name in the darkness and among the metallic echoes of the empty structures. The sound of the machines was not heard by anyone else. After hours of searching, they found Rachel sitting in the center of the largest building in the factory, exactly where the old coal conveyor belts used to be. She was alive, but she was not well. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, her knees pulled to her chest, her hands covered in dark dust. There were no serious injuries on her body, but her expression was that of someone who had seen something she could not explain. When they tried to speak to her, Rachel did not answer at first. She only repeated in a low voice, as if reading something invisible in the air, "They're still working. They're still working." The police found her phone lying on the ground a few meters away. The camera was still recording. Later, when they reviewed the photos and videos, they noticed something no one had seen during the rescue. In several images, human-shaped shadows appeared near the rusted machines. They were not reflections. They were not members of the search team. The figures stood exactly where the old workers used to be during their production shifts. In one of the videos, a background sound to be clearly heard, metal striking, gears turning, and voices counting numbers, where there was no one physically present. Rachel never returned to that place. She never finished that school project, and she never fully explained what she saw inside that warehouse. Not long after, the area was fenced off and closed to visitors, but residents of nearby towns still say that on certain silent nights, when the wind moves down through the valley, it is possible to hear a noise coming from the ruins, as if the factory had never stopped working, as if the men who died there were still completing their shift.